Okay, so hello everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar on biodiversity net gain. We're just about to start now, so I'll move on to our agenda. So again, yeah, thanks for joining. So over the next hour, we're going to kind of give you a bit of a first principles introduction into what biodiversity and net gain is from myself, Ross Primmett, and Imogen Player. We're both consultants at Action Sustainability. We've then got a series of guest speakers, so we'll have a section from Nick White, who's the Biodiversity Strategy Manager at Natural England, talking about legislation and how there are going to be some key changes coming up in the not too distant future around biodiversity and net gain. We'll then have a short piece from Julia Baker, who is the Biodiversity Technical Specialist at Balfour Beatty, talking about how to implement net gain at project level. And then we'll have a kind of net gain and organisation perspective on net gain from Neil Strong, who's the Biodiversity Strategy Manager for Network Rail. After each section, we'll have a kind of brief point for each of our speakers to address a couple of questions, and then we'll have a kind of sum up and closing questions piece at the end. So again, this will be the introduction. So just to give you some first principles around biodiversity, because I'm sort of conscious that it's one of those topics that there can be quite a few bits of terminology around it. So you know, when we talk about a species, it's a type of plant or animal. So an example you might encounter on a construction site could be, you know, the common badger. A habitat is the environment in which that particular animal lives. So for example, a badger might live in the woods. An ecosystem is the kind of community in which those groups and plants and animals live and interact with each other. So, you know, again, you might have deciduous woodland, and within that, a badger performs a number of functions that kind of generates nutrient cycling, carbon cycling, that kind of thing, that makes that whole system work. And then biodiversity is the term which describes the number of species or the variety of life in that ecosystem. So, for example, within the UK, deciduous woodland is a highly biodiverse ecosystem because there are lots of species that live within it. And you know, to cut to the chase, you know, why is biodiversity important? So, you know, we're all part of biodiversity, and we are dependent on a healthy and biodiverse world for maintaining Earth's support systems. So, you know, at basic level, that can be things like clean air, clean water. You know, more specifically, you know, you might say that the Amazon rainforest locks away carbon, reduces climate change, you know, regulates local climate through transpiration. You know, pollinators like bees are responsible for producing the kind of a lot of the food that we eat. It's interesting, you know, that we can put numbers on it. Bees might be worth £651 million to the UK economy through the services that they provide. You know, from a physical perspective, salt marshes and mangrove swamps protect our coast from erosion, and you know, maybe more out there, things like you know, we potentially might get treatments for COVID-19 through antibodies in llama blood. So you know, there's a lot of value that a diverse world brings us. And one of the things that's becoming more apparent is in the period 1970 to 2014, you know, studies have shown that 60% of animal populations have declined, and we're actually now considered to be living in a mass extinction event. And by having a less biodiverse world, the species around us are less able to cope with the changes that, you know, our way of life is actually causing to the planet. And just now to kind of jump to the biodiversity mitigation hierarchy. So this is how we think about how we reduce our impacts to biodiversity in construction. So this is essentially saying that on a construction project, there is an impact to biodiversity. As a priority, you know, by looking at how we run that project, the first thing we need to look at is avoiding that impact. Once we've considered, you know, the maximum amount we can avoid, we then look at how can we minimize that impact. And then once we kind of looked at how we can minimize as much as we can, then we then look at restoring habitats. And then once we've looked at restoring, you know, if we can't do that anymore, then we need to look at offsetting. And then hopefully a combination of those things then leads to a net gain in biodiversity. for construction projects. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague Imogen to talk about netgain.
Thanks, Ross. So I'm also just going to give you a quick introduction to what actually is netgain. So biodiversity netgain is where you leave the environment in a better state than it was before you started development. So after the project or site is completed, it should have an increase or a net gain in biodiversity compared to before the site or project development began. Previously, you might have heard of the term no net loss, which is when any areas developed should have no loss of biodiversity. However, net gain is really about improving the biodiversity through development compared to before the project development began. So net gain can be achieved through schemes that provide an overall increase in natural habitat and ecological features. But a really key thing here is just that you must apply the mitigation hierarchy first. So just a reminder of what Ross just said previously. So why is it relevant to the construction industry? Well, there's a few reasons. The first is for statutory requirements. So as part of the government's 25-year environment plan and the environment bill, developers will have to make sure that a biodiversity net gain of 10% is achieved on developments. So there's also another couple of reasons. So client requirements, you may start to see this showing up more in your client requirements, as well as requirements and questions for working in the community. So particularly on any large projects, you might see some requirements for working in the community. So whilst we've told you a bit about why it's relevant to the construction industry, we'd really like to hear about why you think it's relevant to you and what you'd like to get from this webinar. So if I could ask you to open up your phone or a browser on your laptop or whatever device that you're on, open up another tab and go to menti.com. So that's menti.com. And I'll just open up the screen. So what you'll see, you go to menti.com and you'll be asked to enter a code. So if I could ask you to enter the code 1824600, that will take you to the Menti that we're using. And we're asking you, what would you like to get from this webinar? So you should see a couple of boxes there where we'd just like you to put in your thoughts and comments as to what you'd like to get from this webinar. So you've got to go to menti.com. So that's menti.com and enter the code 1824600. So we've got some things coming up on the screen now. Great. So we're looking for insight and knowledge, innovation, practical ideas, actionable points, update on legislations, simple process guidance, lesson sharing, more practical advice, some best practice examples, winning bid ideas, measurement tools, actionable steps, how to actually implement biodiversity net gain, principal contractor requirements, UK-wide action, on the flooding through now, and how to work with other people. So I'll just give you a few more seconds if there's anything else that you'd like to put in there. But this is really helpful. We can share this with you afterwards as well. So there's a range there, but looking at best practice examples, guidance, perspectives and ideas. That's great. That's really great. Thank you very much. Well, hopefully we'll now cover quite a lot of your answers and what you'd like to get from this webinar during the session. So I'll pop back to the presentation now, and I'll hand over to Nick.
Many thanks indeed, Imogen, and thanks everyone for joining. It's great to be with you this afternoon. So my name is Nick White. I'm the Principal Advisor for netgain within Natural England, which is the Government Advisor for the Natural Environment. And just going to be talking about legislation, what's changing and why this might matter to you in your work. But before doing so, I just want to kind of reiterate some things that are already out there and already in place. So biodiversity net gain is already in the National Planning Policy Framework. It was updated last year, includes some updated guidance around it in terms of planning practice guidance. So it's a useful thing to look at. Just before the election last year as well, MHCLG, so the government ministry for homes and local communities, published a national design guide as well, which also includes details around biodiversity net gain. And also within a couple of national policy statements, particularly that to do with new nuclear and water resources, also talks about biodiversity net gain. And you'll see it increasingly implemented at a local plan level as well by local planning authorities. So planning authorities currently have a mandate to introduce biodiversity net gain locally through their local plan. But the main change that's coming, and the one that Imogen was alluding to, is around mandatory net gain. And this is in relation to the Environment Bill, which is currently in Parliament. So this is a quite significant piece of legislation. It will apply to England only. And what it does, it has the effect of amending the Town and Country Planning Act. And it introduces a requirement that all developments that go through the Town and Country Planning Act must do so and achieve a minimum 10% biodiversity net gain. And they must all use the same metric for measuring that net gain. So it'll be based on what's described at the moment as the Biodiversity Metric 2.0, which I'll come on to. The bill requires that any habitat delivered either on-site or off-site should be secured for at least 30 years. And the bill actually has a spatial delivery hierarchy within it. So when Ross was talking about the kind of mitigation hierarchy, what the bill emphasises is that it expects any project to firstly consider and seek to achieve net gain on the site in the first instance. It recognises that's not always possible. So where that can't be done either wholly or in part, you are then encouraged as a project to look off-site by the purchase of habitat units from local landowners, which could be NGOs, could be farmers, could be a range of organisations. If that's not possible, so if you can't do any net gain on site, and equally if there's no one with land able to sell you the kind of biodiversity outcomes you need, the bill also makes provision for the establishment of statutory biodiversity credits, which are credits you could buy from government. They'll be invested in biodiversity gain outcomes, but they're intended to make sure that there aren't any situations where a project is stuck, it can't achieve net gain on site, and there's no local way of delivering net gain. So they will be available as well. Any landowner that's interested in providing land for developers to purchase and credits from, units from, and be available for biodiversity net gain. So anyone that wants to enter into the net gain market must provide habitat units that are registered on the net gain register. The bill is also unlikely to become law until early 2023, and so at the moment it's in Parliament. There's a 2-year transition period and will be introduced in 2023. A couple of things to stress: the bill doesn't change existing legal protections, and it doesn't apply to nationally significant infrastructure projects or to marine. So just quickly in terms of the process, so this diagram seeks to describe it. So drawing on industry standards and guidance and making reference to local strategies around where people see priorities for net gain, a development would use the metric in conjunction with a site survey to establish whether they can achieve net gain on site or not. They would then look to either submit their proposal and submit their net gain plan to say, I can do it on my site. If they can't do that, then they buy any shortfall from the local market. And if they can't do that, they have the option of buying statutory credits as their means of achieving net gain. And that's the process that a development will go through. So the bill has four key themes. Firstly, that net gains are measurable, and it's using this standard metric, which I'll come on to. Secondly, it has this element of a spatial delivery hierarchy, so this idea of achieving net gain firstly on-site or locally or through credits. It also seeks to ensure that net gain delivers not just benefits for nature, but also for people, so the local communities, and kind of process benefits for the planning authority and developer. So it's intended to make the whole process more consistent and more transparent. And more objective, but equally it's doing that without replacing existing environmental protections or legislations, which still need to go through the usual licensing, etc. routes where needed. So where is the bill? So it was introduced to the House of Commons on the 30th of January of this year. It reached the public bill committee stage when COVID impacted it, as well as many other things. The bill committee hasn't yet started kind of rediscussing the bill, so we're expecting the bill committee stage to start picking up discussions imminently. Looking at rural assent in 2021, so spring 21, which would mean with a 2-year transition that it becomes a mandatory requirement in spring 2023. Meanwhile, a lot of the bill comprises secondary legislation, which government is currently working on, and some elements of that will be consulted on next year. So something to look out for next year. I mentioned this is all, a lot of this is based on the use of a single consistent metric, Biodiversity Metric 2. It uses habitat features as a proxy measure for wider biodiversity, and it translates that into a language of biodiversity units. So it doesn't consider species, it doesn't include indirect impacts. It measures all types of habitats, including intertidal and rivers, and also green infrastructure features such as green roofs and walls, etc. So any habitat type can be found in it. And it bases a calculation on the size of the habitat or its length, its condition, its distinctiveness, where it's spatially connected, located, and how ecologically connected it is as well. And it comes with a free calculation tool. We published a beta version, as this is Natural England, of the metric in July of last year, and that went out to consultation, and that consultation closed in February. We've been working on the responses to that, and we recently published a kind of summary response to the consultation, and we're looking to re-release the metric in its final form in December of this year. Again, we'll come with a free calculation tool, as well as summary and detailed guidance and revised condition assessment methodologies. At the same time, we'll also be releasing a test version of a metric for smaller sites, so essentially a simplified version of the main metric that's for use for smaller developments, and that will be going out to consultation in December of this year. So why is this relevant? So it's important just to stress that any development on the Town and Country Planning Act from spring 2023 will need to achieve this minimum 10% biodiversity net gain, and local planning authorities may locally vary that percentage upwards. Everyone will need to be familiar with the biodiversity metric, because that's the metric that everyone will need to use, landowner and developer alike. And developers will also need to submit a biodiversity net gain plan alongside their net gain calculations. Planning authorities should provide information about where their strategic biodiversity priorities are. Ultimately, that will take the form of local nature recovery strategies, but there may be other equivalent documents in place that are used in the interim, such as green infrastructure strategies or biodiversity opportunity areas. People already are, but it's important to start thinking about embedding biodiversity net gain into the design process as early as possible. It's often the easiest way to achieve net gain is by getting it in early and thinking about it early. And there's already some existing guidance and advice available to refer to. So the triumvirate of Syria, SAIEM and IEMA published some guidance fairly recently, which is being updated. Early next year, the British Standard for Biodiversity Net Gain will be coming out, and also expect to see more detailed government advice coming out over the next couple of years as well. A couple of other developments just to quickly reference. All of this has been talked about terrestrially. There's now a growing interest and appetite to take forward marine net gain. So work is beginning to start now on what net gain for marine might look like, and the development of a marine metric. Equally, although nationally significant infrastructure projects aren't covered in the Environment Bill, a number of individual operators and schemes are committing to biodiversity net gain, and we are expecting, as NPSs get updated, there to be an increased focus on biodiversity net gain for NSIPs. The 25-year Environment Plan also emphasised that government's ambition is for environmental net gain. That remains their objective, and there's a pilot metric being developed to help move towards that, called an eco-metric, and that will be published early next year. And then also just to draw your attention to the recent planning white paper. So lots of changes proposed for the planning system. But again, some of the things it emphasises are on strategic solutions, the importance of design and sustainability, idea of zoning, and everything moving to digital. And again, that will feed across ultimately into approaches for net gain and sort of be embedded into that as well. So that's my contact details if anyone wants to get in touch. But otherwise, Imogen, back to you if there's any questions.
Yes, we do have a few questions coming through. So the first one is, is there a particular reason that marine projects aren't covered, or are there separate laws and metrics for them?
Yeah, so the reason marine isn't covered in the bill is the bill only relates to Town and Country Planning Act developments, and basically they only take you down to the mean low water mark, so they don't extend into wider marine. That said, there's a recognition that actually it would make sense to include wider marine over time. Obviously, the sea doesn't sort of end at the end of the seashore, and so work is now starting on an approach to marine net gain for English waters. We don't quite know yet what form that's going to take, but obviously a number of projects will have connectors coming ashore. So an offshore wind turbine, for example, will have connectors coming ashore. It would be sensible, and that those two systems for net gain do interact with one another and are nested with one another as well. So yes, the marine approach I expect will learn lessons from terrestrial, and will need to work with the terrestrial system.
Great. So the next question is, if you have no biodiversity on site, for example, no existing buildings with no green roofs, etc., how is the 10% measured?
It's a very good question, because obviously 10% is zero, will always be zero. So there literally is nothing on site. You can't use a percentage mechanism. Our advice to planning authorities in that situation is to request a minimum uplift in biodiversity units, or the amount of biodiversity they'd like to see. So yeah, an area increase, for example. In terms of the bill itself, there will be more detail set out in terms of whether there's any minimum thresholds against which it applies. But it ought to be, if you've got a site that's literally got nothing on it, one of the easiest scenarios in which to achieve some sort of net gain uplift, because obviously anything would be better than nothing. It's just you won't be able to use the percentage as a mechanism.
Thanks. We've actually got loads of questions coming through, so I don't think we'll be able to answer them all, but just a couple more before we have to move on. So what will be the new arrangements in relation to protected or priority species?
So the arrangements don't change for those at all. So it's still with they still retain their existing protections. They still go through the existing licensing or other regimes for those. You would need to include information about those and how you are addressing their needs as part of your wider biodiversity net gain plan that you submit to the planning authority. The metric is quite simple, so it doesn't consider species itself, but you still need to deliver meet those needs separately.
Great, thanks. I think we've got time for one more question. So what is required now, and what can we ask for now and in the transition period?
So for a local planning authority, the fact that net gain is in the NPPF, that allows a planning authority to set local requirements for net gain. Some already do that. An obvious one that often gets referred to is Warwickshire, who've been essentially operating a net gain system in Warwickshire for a number of years. It will depend on the detail of what's set out in that local authority's plans as to what their minimum expectations are. And you may find some planning authorities that have no expectations. Equally, we're, as an organisation, we're encouraging people to be thinking about and embedding net gain. I know a number of companies have already got internal kind of KPIs as well that they're working to achieve. So partly it will depend on what's your business's objective, or what's the project's objectives that it may have set itself. And equally, is there anything the consenting body is asking for? And if it's a planning authority, they've already got scope to be requiring biodiversity net gain. And if they do, I would encourage you to be seeking as much clarification from them as to what they're expecting, so what metric to use, how much net gain, questions like that.
That's great. Thanks very much, Nick. For the other questions that we haven't got time to that Nick hasn't got time to answer for now, we can always answer in emails. So we'll get back to you on them. Thanks, Nick. I think we'll now pass over to Julia.
Great. And good afternoon, everyone. Can I check you can hear me okay?
Yep, we can. Thanks, Julia.
So let's have a think now about biodiversity net gain, particularly on a construction project. And my work as Balfour Beatty is very much sort of construction focused. I'm going to be talking through kind of 3 top tips, if you like, in terms of biodiversity net gain on a project level. But I do want to emphasize something that Nick mentioned. this is what we do in industry. You know, we always ask, what does good look like? What's the benchmark that we work from? And in 2016, the good practice principles were published by our 3 leading environmental and professional institutes, so the Chartered Institute of Ecology, IEMA, and Syria. And all of those good practice principles apply as one bundle. So it is very much to take all of those throughout a project and to apply them. So thinking about all of those, when you do get to a project site, my kind of 3 top tips. The first one actually starts off with avoid and reduce. You know, it just makes all the sense in the world, because as Nick mentioned, most of your life with biodiversity net gain will be a percentage increase. So the more that you take away, the more that you've got to give back. And avoid and reduce is just the go-to starting point for any construction project. Now, I work a lot on transport networks, and we are really, firstly fixed in terms of our work location. That's the road that we're either improving a junction, or that might be the railway. So it's a fixed location, but I'm always incredibly surprised about what we can do when it comes back to avoid and reduce. And there's a couple of really some practical advice that I want to run through with you. Firstly, the engineering solutions now are far beyond what they ever were, and the difference between, you know, the slight levels of slope on a cutting or an embankment can really make a difference, just the amount of habitat. And when you start to quantify that habitat loss, as Nick mentioned, through the metric, it can make such a difference to your 10% net gain. But the real point that I want to make with avoid of use is to start this as early as possible and to involve the contractors. It makes such a difference, and I've seen this time and time again. When contractors are involved early, it's that brilliant coming together of the engineering excellence in design with that buildability knowledge to really work on those solutions. But also, we need to factor in all of the temporary works. Temporary works, you know, you have your permanent works design, there is always temporary works that come across it, material storage, temporary roads, temporary drainage, all of those things. We need to think about that as early as possible to really make sure we're hitting that avoid and reduce. And just to run through a couple of examples, so this was a couple of the embankments had already been designed, and it was a landscape bund, and our arboriculturist looked at that, and it was a particularly special tree that we were like, no, come on, you know, we've got to be able to do something there. So he just drew these, he just drew them out just to start the conversation, just to have something on the table to go through. We got our engineers from the construction team, we got our sub-agents, we got the landscape designer on board, and it is this cross-disciplinary look. You know, we had to get the drainage guys come on board, but because he started that conversation, we could then actually change the design and retain that tree. So it is possible, absolutely, but this was quite late. We did it, but it was a lot of retrofitting. So it's so much smarter and more efficient if you can bring these ideas onto the table early, and if you can bring the contractors on board early. Another example, sort of top left in the red circle there, that was actually an existing patch of woodland, and it was marked down for clearance because it was a material storage area, and then replanted with woodland. So we were just like, look, okay, what can we do here? So we explored all possibilities of that. And there was another option further away, but that involved pretty much doubling our haul road use of vehicles, and it was much nearer the local village. And that was just too much of a trade-off. By the time that we've doubled our vehicles going up and down and the disturbance to the local village, so we don't win everyone that we try and put on the table. And, you know, we live in a world of construction which is all about finding that middle balance. And we didn't win that one, but that doesn't stop us from trying. And the picture on the right-hand side, one of our project managers was absolutely keen on this, and he was challenging the construction team to look, put your temporary works into the permanent work footprint. Let's really work with this. And they all took it on board so brilliantly. And I got this email from one of the agents, and that's the email that I want to get. He'd found that, and he worked out a solution, and we did. He really owned that savior. That saving that piece of habitat. So it's a really joint effort when it comes to construction anyway, let alone with this first point about avoid and reduce, to bring everyone around the table, particularly the contractors. So avoid and reduce, we've got to work as a team, and there is stuff that we can do even when we're working with very tight spaces, even when we're working with a fixed footprint such as a road or a railway or energy or housing project. Consider all temporary works. They always come up, always. And we've actually used a lot of BIM modeling to feasibility test what we're thinking about. But also when you get to construction, things change. And we need to respond to that change as best as possible. So using the innovation that we have can really help. And the final point is to measure the wins. And that kind of relates to number 2. So Nick mentioned the metric, and I love it, I have to say, and a shout out to Natural England. I think they've done a fantastic job here with the metric. It's so important to use this in terms of a decision-making tool. I'm still seeing this get left behind. I'm seeing design kind of progress and work along, and then the metric comes down a little bit down the line. We've got to use this as early as possible. And Nick kind of went through this, but I just want to highlight really what it does in a very, very simple way. So on the left, we have a look at the habitat before works, and this generates the units that Nick was talking about. Then we have the habitats after works, and again, all the factors that Nick talked about, it generates the units after works. So there's a lot behind the metric, but we're essentially looking at the difference before and after works in habitat types. Now, I'm going to come back to this point, but we've got to use this as early as possible. When we had that word cloud, people were asking for practical advice. An action tip, it's this. Don't wait for the magic source of perfect data. I spend my life on Google Maps, even more so under lockdown, but use it as early as possible because the metric helps make decisions, and we don't want to leave that too late. And there's a couple of particular points here that, yes, and while I love the metric, there are a couple of glitches, and I'm sure Nick will recognize this in the existing format. So use it as a decision-making tool, but also use it appropriately. And the couple of other key points here, the design to construction handover in terms of the metric, in terms of the digital data, in terms of the habitat data is key. I've had so many painful discussions about GIS systems that don't match up, or CAD systems from a designer, from a contractor. So another bit of practical advice is to have that conversation early. Use the metric as early as possible, and also use it as a live tracker during construction. Things change in construction. I've never worked on a project that hasn't changed. So we need to keep track of that changes to respond. But also, I work for Balfour Beatty, so a contractor. We're being increasingly asked for an as-built metric. So that's a as-built, that's the data as we've built it, that's the data that we collect. So that's a change. We need to collect the data during construction that can be used to produce an as-built metric. The other thing about the metric that I like is that it gives us a sense of really red flags. So we know that irreplaceable habitats and certain statutory designated sites are not part of biodiversity net gain, but the metric will score very high distinctiveness habitats as well. And you can see on the slides there, any loss is unacceptable, and it won't even calculate your units. It comes up with errors. And to get over that, you have to click a box that is bespoke compensation that you've achieved. Now, I've used this at a very early stage, and the developer actually avoided that habitat because he didn't want that. His version of bespoke compensation was time and cost through that conversation and discussion with Natural England and the local authority. So because I showed that to him early, we were early enough in the process to really change his design. So the metric is invaluable in that sense. And the final kind of my third top tip, if you like, when I go around to construction sites, the one question that I'm always asked is, okay, Julia, you talked a lot about this, but what do we actually do? What does this actually look like on a construction site? And this is actually when it's really, really simple. Yes, okay, we've gone through the mitigation hierarchy and we've applied the metric, but on a construction site, we're either going to be delivering more habitats or we're going to be making existing habitats better. And that's it. That's what it comes down to. Now, I'm not talking about all the protected species stuff. As Nick mentioned, there's no change there. I'm talking about net gain. So no matter what you're building, no matter where you are, it's more or better habitats. And I use that phrase, I use it with our site foremen, I use it right up in terms of our senior executives, because that's what net gain comes back to. So that's the final point that we're looking at. We're either making more habitats or making those existing habitats better. So when it really comes down to a project, take all of those good practice principles, all of them, and that's what our benchmark is to measure ourselves against. But my three top tips, if you like: avoid and reduce, get contractors on board early, get everyone around the table and come up with those joint engineering solutions that can really make a difference. Use the metric as early as possible. Be transparent about how I was going to say data limitations, but in my world, it's how rubbish the data is, or if it's okay from Google Maps. But measure it, measure your progress, measure your outcomes, use the metric as early as possible, don't wait. And then finally, we're doing habitat stuff. You're making more habitats or you're making existing habitats better. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julia. We've got just a few questions coming in. We've got loads of questions, so we won't be able to answer them all, but just a couple for you, Julia. So the first one is, how are temporary impacts that may be mitigated by new habitat creation taken into account in the DEFRA metric? Would it count as a loss and then a gain?
Yes, yeah, good question. So the metric does account for direct impacts only, and that direct impact can be a temporary loss or it can be a permanent loss. So if it's a temporary loss, you do record it as a loss, and then there's a tab for habitat creation. So if you're planting, say for example, you've got to remove some habitat for a material storage area like the one that I had, or for an access road, and then you're replanting afterwards, record it as a loss, and the replanting afterwards comes under creation in the metric. So it does definitely count.
That's great, thank you. And the next question is, when a project is restricted by a client DCO and the contractor has no or little input, how can the contractor ensure that biodiversity net gain is applied before work commences?
Oh yeah, I don't know who answered that question, but I get that all the time as a contractor. It's so frustrating when we're brought in late in the day and we can have these great engineering solutions. It doesn't stop me from bringing them to the table, even if it's too late, because that might be something that the client takes to the next project. I mean, things always change in construction, but we try to proactively engage our clients as early as possible. Even if we're not yet appointed, we'll still issue some biodiversity net gain options or something like that. So we're at this interesting phase where there's such variation around the country, but it's really for us to put it on the table as early as possible and then work with what we've got. As I mentioned, we don't win every victory that I want to go through, but it doesn't stop us from trying. And the moment then when we get to the actual construction, I've had clients commission biodiversity net gain halfway through construction, just because they get it. We're the ones who brought it to the table, so anything is possible.
Thanks, Julia. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. So the next one is, when looking at the matrix and the metrics, as a client, if you're finding it overwhelming and complicated, who should you appoint to carry out the assessment at early planning stage?
Yeah, a really good ecologist, basically. I mean, it is all about habitats, and it does require those skills and expertise by an ecologist. So I would look out for the ecologist. There's training by the Chartered Institute in the metrics, and also just really great ecologists who really understand habitats and are brilliant at surveying just the habitats themselves and the condition assessments. So a good, skilled and qualified ecologist.
Thanks, Julia. And the final question, do you have any advice for net gain opportunities on refurbishment projects which have limited options?
Oh gosh, I mean the amount of green walls, and we've got a new thing on one of our projects, instant hedges, which are my new Google search of choice, and green planters. I mean, just the amount of different green infrastructure that's coming through now, different rain gardens and things like that, and they all add up. You know, the metric does count for all of this. So you can get really inventive and really creative, and I don't know exactly what you're looking at, but definitely have a look at the innovations that are coming out of the landscape sector now for green infrastructure, because there's loads of interesting stuff out there.
Thanks so much, Julia. That's great. I think, again, there are some more questions, so we can always answer them and get them back to you. But I think now we'll pass over to Neil.
Hiya, thanks, Imogen. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for waiting on for me. So I'm Neil Strong, Biodiversity Strategy Manager at Network Rail, and over the next few minutes, I'll just give you a little bit of a perspective from an organisation's point of view. And just to put it into context, if for those of you who aren't aware, this is the coverage of our estate, the whole of Great Britain. But if you squash our land into a small ball, you end up with something about the size of the Isle of Wight and a half, which is 52,000 hectares. So massive opportunity for biodiversity across that estate, covering as it does the length and breadth of Britain. What I'm going to do is just take you through the last 200 years of the railway in one slide, which basically starts off in the top left with Stockton to Darlington, and then looks at how the railway managed its estate over the last 200 years, starting off with basically the PPE of the time of tweed and flat caps, with guys with scythes and sickles managing the estate, managing the wildflower grasslands, and the reason being so that if there were fires, they were cold fires and the whole embankment didn't start burning. But as technology came through the railway, diesel trains, electric trains, the perception was that vegetation management wasn't required as much. And then we move into electric signalling systems. There's less cables using the 7/4 signalling approach. So the vegetation tended to get closer to the railway than it had ever been at any point, especially the large woody vegetation. And what that brought about over the last 20, 30, 40 years is an increase in the number of incidents. Those three pictures in the middle there, one with a train that's hit a tree, the obligatory leaf on the line, which will be coming into the next 4 or 5 weeks with autumn coming, and then derailments caused by vegetation. Luckily, we haven't had tree-related derailments for some time, but obviously everybody will be well aware of the issues we've had recently up in Stonehaven. The reaction then was that vegetation was bad and therefore needed to be managed, and in some cases quite severely. And that shot in the middle is of Hadley Wood on the East Coast Main Line, which was one of the sites that raised this to national level, to the views in the Palace of Westminster. And the gentleman at the top is Boris's little brother Joe, who was rail minister in the middle of 2018, and actually said to us that we needed to stop all of our vegetation works because they were not convinced that we were managing it properly and were not taking biodiversity into account. He asked the gentleman at the bottom, John Varley, to get involved and to do an independent review of what Network Rail does with its vegetation management. And John took 6 months and published what is now known as the Varley Review. And that set out a number of recommendations for the rail industry. The first recommendation, there's no icon for it, was at the Department for Transport, and they were told basically to give us clear policy on how we should be managing our vegetation. But essentially what the Varley Review found was that we needed to have governance in place across the business to understand what was going on with our estate. We needed to manage the asset as an asset and to value it as an asset rather than as an issue. We needed to look at having an ambitious vision for our work. we needed to get better at communicating with our stakeholders, not only the industry and the train operators, but also our line side neighbours, of whom we have 7 million direct neighbours across the railway. And we needed a culture change within the industry to make sure that people didn't see biodiversity as something extra to do, something that got in the way, but it was actually part of the day job. And what that then resulted over the period from the publication of the review was the DFT setting the policy, and then us coming up and with a response to those recommendations. And part of the recommendations within the DFT policy was that Network Rail as an organisation had to achieve no net loss of biodiversity on its estate by 2024, and then it had to work towards setting to achieving biodiversity net gain on its estate by 2040 within the policy. And one of the issues that we have with that is that we need to understand what net is before we can start working out what net gain was. And that came up in one of the questions. If you've got nothing already, then what is your net gain? We obviously have a lot of biodiversity, and we needed to establish a baseline. And so what we are doing at the moment is working with the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology to understand what our baseline of biodiversity is, understand where the habitats are, so that we can make an assessment of that biodiversity and work forward to then understanding how we are impacting on that. And it's not just the difference with our estate is that it isn't so much the development. This is the routine maintenance that we have to undertake in order to make sure that trains can run around safely, and that the people who are working on the railway are doing that in a safe manner as well. And the approach that we're taking to understand and to measure that biodiversity, we cannot, and there isn't the resource across Britain to have ecologists across the railway network undertaking detailed surveys. There just isn't the resource, there isn't the money, and also we don't have the time to do that. We are looking at particular methodologies, and as I say, we're working with CEH to remotely survey the rail network, those 52,000 hectares, so that we can do this safely. We can do it without having people in the vicinity of trains, and then we will then take people onto the ground and to ground truth that data, so that we can make sure that the information we're getting that enables the managers to then understand and to start programming works. And as Julia says, so that we've got it up front, so that we know what we've got before we start doing the work, and then look at the way that we do the work, so that it isn't necessarily a complete clear fell of a section that might be a particular issue during the autumn, but it's actually managing those trees further back from the line side, opening up, having more open space close to the railway lines, close to the overhead power lines, and moving the trees slightly further away. Alongside that, one of the recommendations from the Value Review was that we needed a biodiversity action plan, and this is due to be published towards the end of this year, again working with CEH, and it is looking to reverse the decline of the biodiversity that Ross talked about earlier on. That we have a number of different types of habitat across the railway. We've obviously got a lot of woodland, but there is opportunities for having those species-rich grasslands that are in decline, and that we can manage on our side of the fence, and less disturbance potentially. There's no public access on our side of the fence, so there's less disturbance, and if managed correctly, we can manage it potentially more efficiently than we can with the woodland habitat, but also making sure that we can retain that woodland habitat in places where it's safe to do so. So it took the last 200 in one slide. This is the next 15 years of where we're at, and we are looking at that biodiversity action plan later this year. We will have the initial habitat baseline by the end of this year, and as we go forward, recommendations within the review are to be able to report on the state of our estate every year, and then looking to be compliant with new standards by the end of 21, and then having that annual reporting will enable us to move towards understanding the biodiversity no net loss status of the network by the end of 2024. And as I say, we were set a 2040 target for biodiversity net gain, but we've actually brought that forward as part of our ambition, so that we can achieve that by 2035. And that, I'll leave a nice, I did used to have a sunny photo. There's a nice rainy photo of the railway and the view from the trains. And any questions?
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, we've got some come through. So the first one is, what's Network's rail position for strategic plans? Does this get put on the actual planning application development, or is there a need for biodiversity net gain at a strategic level? In which case, can credits be used at a strategic level?
Easy question to start with. Thank you. So from a strategic point of view, we need to understand what biodiversity we have and how we can then fit that into the plans. The majority of the work that takes place across the railway is the routine maintenance work. There are large scale programs and projects that take place as well. To get that in, to understand the impact that those may have as well, we do have to go through planning in some instances, but other times we don't have to do the same planning, being a statutory undertaker. So it is something that we're looking at to understand what we have, and then we can move forward with the strategies. And that's part of my new role. It's a role that's just been started within the organisation. We have a new environmental sustainability strategy. We now have a biodiversity strategy manager to go with that. And so that is going to be something I'll be taking forwards.
That's great. Thanks, Neil. So the next question is, will Network Rail be moving to the use of UK HAB from phase 1?
Yes. We basically, yes, we did have, so we've worked, we worked with Julia for some time on we used to have a Network Rail biodiversity calculator. We're taking on board the use of the Biodiversity Metric 2.0, and we'll be using that going forwards.
That's great, thank you. If anyone else does have any other questions for Neil, please do drop them into the chat box. I think we are currently out of ones just for Neil at the minute, but in which case I think I might just open up questions to Nick as well, if you're still on the line, Nick.
I am, yeah. I'm going to have to go in about 5 minutes for another webinar. But yeah.
So just in terms of the metrics, how does that apply to Scotland as well?
So the metric, as Neil was mentioning and as Joe was asking, is based on using UK HAB as a way of identifying habitat types. It can be applied in Scotland. There's no reason why it couldn't. I know some Scottish companies are already looking to work with it, like SSE. Currently, though, the legislation I was referring to only applies to England, so it'll be dependent on what Scotland chooses to do in terms of policy and legislation, etc. But in terms of how the metric itself operates, it could work across the United Kingdom.
That's great. Thanks very much, Nick. So the next question is for Neil. How do Network Rail identify what species are present?
On the network, well, if it's at a local level, then we will have people doing local surveys if prior to projects taking place. The remote sensing won't be going down to the species level. It'll be stopping at the habitat level. But if it's, we do have surveys take place on the network. So if we need to identify species, we'll start off with desktop studies. I saw there was a question about local record centres. Yes, we do use local record centres. We are trying to build up relationships with all the local record centres to understand what is there. And then if we need to go to site, we will undertake surveys safely with the ecologists on site.
That's great, thank you. And is the target for Network Rail to have the 10% net gain in place, was it by 2035?
We have to achieve biodiversity net gain by 2035, yes. There was not a percentage mark put on that achievement. Once we know what net is, then we'll be able to look at the mark, but it's likely to be something like that, yes.
Great, thanks. So I think we've got time for a couple more questions for Neil. So if you do have any, please put them in.
I notice in the moderator one, there's a few specific site location questions coming through. I'm happy to take those specifically, because if they're relating to particular issues, then we can deal with that. I can find the right people within our comms teams to answer those questions, so I can take those offline.
That's great. Thanks, Neil. And just one here, from where can we download the latest Biodiversity NetGain Metric 2.0?
So just very quickly, Imogen, it's on the Natural England Products and Publications catalogue. The easiest way, if you Google Biodiversity Metric 2.0, that will take you to the page and you can download it and the guidance documents. As I said, the updated, kind of revised version of it will be available from December, and that should be in the same place. And you should also be able to access it via gov.uk as well.
That's great. Thanks so much. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So for Neil, how does Network Rail consider natural corridors?
We've got 20,000 miles of them across Britain. We run trains up to 125 miles an hour through the middle of them with 25,000 volts of AC electricity in some places. So we have natural corridors. We're looking at how we can, using the habitat analysis together with connectivity assessments that we're getting from CEH, we will then be better to understand not only our corridors, but those that we go through the middle of, and so that connectivity. And that will be something then, when we're planning works, we'll be able to better plan so that we can make sure we can undertake the vegetation management that we need to do, but also do it in such a way that it helps with the connectivity from sites either side of the railway.
That's great, thanks. And another question here. So how does Network Rail embed the Varley review that you were speaking about earlier?
We do that through briefings to the staff. It is something, it's been 18 months now since John Varley published the review. Actually, it's longer than that's 2 years. 2 years in November. So we are taking forward the recommendations. We have a specific program that is looking at not only the biodiversity elements that were raised by John Varley, but also other issues like weather resilience and climate change, and also the energy use and decarbonisation of the railway. These are all within 2 programs that we are running, and they are network-wide programs. So there are staff from across the business who are involved in these programs. So we've taken what John Varley has put to us and have taken it up a level so that we've got the program doing the work. It's involving not only the mapping of the biodiversity, but also improving the capability, the competency of the staff we have, and making sure also that our contractors, when they're coming on to the network, also understand what we're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you. Next question is it quite habitat focused as opposed to species focused? What's your outlook? Do you prioritize on species or habitat?
The way that we're monitoring the biodiversity to start with is going to be at the habitat level, because of the approach to having the extent of the network and being able to do that to give us those metrics to start with. When we then start to do the work at a local level, that's when we will pick up the species impacts that we may have and then tailor the work accordingly. So it's hopefully a gradation that will take us through understanding what the habitats are, and then when we start ground truthing, understanding what species are in those habitats.
That's great. I think that's probably all we've got time for now. So thanks so much, Neil. That was great. And thanks to all of our speakers. I would just ask that when we finish the webinar, it will automatically take you to a feedback page. So you could just fill in the feedback form. It'll take about 2 minutes, and let us know your thoughts, what else you're interested in learning about, if we were to put any more webinars on, and how you found this webinar. So with that, just like to say a massive thanks to everyone. Thanks, Ross. Thanks, Neil and Julia and Nick, and hope that you found it helpful.
Thanks, Imogen. Thanks for running this.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.